Broadcasting live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News. The news you can trust.
Okay, so I'm not going to try to top last week's archaeology news in terms of wackiness. So this week's archaeology news is going to be a little bit more inspirational. Okay, maybe not that inspirational, but hopefully it will be enough to inspire some of you to get your asses off the couch and into the dust. So, we're going to stay here in the UK to see how a bunch of normal members of the community like yourselves have managed to make a difference in the world of archaeology. First, just by gardening. No metal detector even needed in this case. And we're going to go to Coventry in the UK, where a teacher named Gran Senior found an amazing discovery right in his backyard. You see, this was in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, and this guy was a geography teacher. So yeah, not much teaching or learning going on. Well, one day he was in his backyard just doing a little digging and gardening, and he found a very strange-looking stone with these cut marks on it. And I guess being a well-read teacher, he kind of suspected immediately what he was looking at. But the issue is there's not that many people who can translate this ancient language anymore, so it took him a while to get it confirmed. But as it turns out, these seemingly random cut marks are part of an early medieval alphabet that comes from Ireland called Ogham. So what is Ogham? Well, it's a system to write down the Celtic Irish language, and it was used between the 4th and 9th centuries. However, it really peaked, at least the remnants of it seem to, from the 5th to 6th centuries in the area around the Irish Sea. Now, why it was created in the first place is not really clear, because we would like to think that it could unlock all of the secrets of the early medieval period, but a bit like Linear B, which we discussed in the context of Mycenae and Minoa, Ogham actually doesn't say very much. We find it carved in stones, and it usually just says something like, John was here. So why you'd need a special language to write something like that is a bit of a mystery. But some people postulate, and isn't that a fancy word, it was created by the Druids to keep their activities secret from the Romans. Now, you're probably right in thinking the Romans never exerted their authority in Ireland, which is true, but certainly the Irish had contact with Roman Britain. And we know the Romans hated the Druids, and they destroyed their order in Gaul and in Britain. So the Irish Druids made this language to be able to have secret messages the Romans wouldn't understand. Sounds a little far-fetched. Others have argued it was basically the same reason to keep things secret, but from when the Irish were actually the aggressors. When they made incursions into Western Britain, usually to capture slaves, they needed a secret writing system to sort of keep track of their movements that the Britons wouldn't understand. And still others say that it might even have been the early Irish Christians looking to keep their worship and activities secret from the predominant pagan culture within Ireland at the time. Well, anyway, any of these could be true or none of them, but they're fueled by later medieval writings like the Book of Ballymore, which I think is from the 14th century, and that openly discusses variants and sort of secret versions of the Ogham script. Now, we just don't know, but one thing we do know is the structure of this written system is very cool. So it started out with 20 letters or feta, and it got 5 more at some point called 4 feta. And those feta were divided into 4 families, or aechmi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So you have these 20 and then 25 feta, then divided into the aechmi. And it's thought that the name of the letters stand for each for a tree or a shrub or a plant name. So, for example, A for alder, B for birch, C for cherry, etc. Anyway, this was a pretty rare find because there have been only about 400 Ogham stones ever found in Britain, but those were mostly found in the West, like Wales or Cornwall, again, because that's where the Irish would have been coming from. But if you look at Coventry, where this stone was found, that's in the Midlands. So it's not very common you find one all the way over there. And to give you an idea of how rare this is, Time Team once found one of these things on the Isle of Man, and they thought it was a pretty big deal.
Believe it or not, these faint marks could belong to one of the earliest forms of writing in the British Isles, Ogham.
Okay, well anyway, so this humble geography teacher was just able to get this confirmed by the experts as a bona fide Ogham stone in the last couple of months, and that's why it's in the news. Now, if you would like to see some great examples of Ogham stones for yourself, there's a great collection in the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin, and also in the British Museum in London. Next up, do you want to engage in some serious archaeology without even leaving your home? Well, that's what the next story is about. It's about a project called Deep Time, which is a joint venture between the National Trust, they are the people who manage a lot of the historical sites in Britain, and Dig Ventures, which is a social enterprise whose mission it is to engage the public more in archaeology. And I've met these Dig Ventures folks before, and let me tell you, they are passionate about this mission. Okay, maybe not that passionate, but it's really important to them. And if there are two things that we know archaeology is lacking, that's money and personnel. And that's why a lot of archaeology gets left undone. So the Deep Time project got together about 1,000 armchair archaeologists to sit and scour lots of satellite and LiDAR data, all in an area called the Peak District, covering about 500 square kilometers or over 200 square miles. And our team of volunteers managed to find about 13,000 archaeological sites or potential archaeological sites, which would include 3 Roman roads and 262 potential Bronze Age barrow, which is a kind of a tomb. Wow, go team! And think about the amount of labor hours that this took. That would have taken professional archaeologists years and years to mobilize. And this work is so important because those sites, if left unstudied, are subject to destruction as the land is developed, or to erosion, or as the climate changes. And in that case, this knowledge would be lost forever if it hadn't been for our trusty volunteers. So really, if you ever want to pitch in and do some archaeology, it doesn't take much. Now we're off to the little village of Collyweston, and don't you love those British place names? You can learn a lot from them, but that's a whole other story. In any event, in this quaint little village, population less than 600, thanks to the dogged determination of the local historical society, there was an important Tudor-era palace discovered right under the village. And for those of you who don't know, the Tudor period lasted approximately 120 years, encompassing a few famous monarchs that you probably have heard of. So all over Britain, there are these local historical and archaeological societies, which are great and very active. But just like civic society in the US, these organizations tend to be exclusively of a very senior membership. So let's just say they're losing membership and vitality through natural attrition. And in fact, that's exactly where this organization was. The old boss had just passed away, and his great-nephew needed to breathe new life into an organization that was failing financially. So they settled on a mission to find this old Tudor palace where kings and queens had frequented. Unfortunately, they didn't have much to go on. It was certainly mentioned in a lot of historical records, but not with a lot of precision about exactly where it was. So other than that, it was just in a few characteristically imprecise old maps and some oral history, such as a walled garden known locally as the Palace Gardens. And it didn't help that people back in the day were not particularly sentimental. So honestly, once the Tudor era came to a close and the Stuarts came in, a lot of the contents of the palace and even the stone itself was likely pilfered, carried off for use elsewhere.
Let's go, boys! Take it out!
So the Historical Society pooled their resources together and paid for a drone survey of the village. And that was followed by a ground-penetrating radar survey, which we did discuss in our G for Geophysics episode. And if you remember from that episode, GPR, ground-penetrating radar, certainly can find walls, and that's just what the group found. The problem? Remember, GPR can only see under the ground. You actually have to dig to find out what's down there. So this area where the walls were found was on private land, and the owners were about to pave it over. So it was a race to find the palace. But as you know, untrained folks should not engage in active archaeology unsupervised, because they're just as likely to destroy the archaeological remains when in fact they can be preserved, or failing to note and record them before they're destroyed. So all of that knowledge would be lost. Now enter the University of Leicester, who lent some of their archaeologists to supervise a limited dig of a few test trenches in the area where the GPR suggested there were structures. And they found enough artifacts and even a flagstone floor that would have been to a high-status building, which proved well enough that the palace was indeed under there. And there you have it, an important Tudor palace found underneath the village, thanks to the efforts of an amateur hobbyist group. Now, this Tudor palace is not quite as dramatic as the story I'm about to tell you, but it does remind me of the finding in 2012 of the remains of the villainous King Richard III underneath the parking lot of a church. Now, he was discovered thanks largely to the efforts of a civilian group called the Richard III Society, led by one Philippa Langley, who had, prior to the discovery, sort of been dismissed as an eccentric. And in that case, too, it happened to be the University of Leicester who oversaw the dig. Now, obviously, the finding of this infamous king caused quite a media sensation, and unfortunately that led to a falling out between the university and Philippa Langley over who would kind of get credit and whose name would go on the discovery, and it did get pretty ugly. Now, if you want to know more about that, you can watch the 2022 movie The Lost King, which dramatized the whole episode. So there you have it. 3 stories where ordinary people made extraordinary archaeological discoveries. Are you inspired yet? Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.